of African leaders are expected. That will include many we think of as authoritarians. Civil society leaders in Africa are less than pleased with the guest list. To find out why, we reached out to Ugandan opposition activist Daniel Kauma. He's in Washington attending an alternative conference on the sidelines of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. This is a big conference, Daniel, with a long guest list. It includes the African Union's head, leaders of oil giants from Nigeria and Angola, Kenya's new president. If the point of the meeting is to deepen the U.S.-Africa partnership, it would seem to make sense to sit down with Africa's most powerful leaders, don't you think?
Well, that's how it's being framed. But I believe inviting some of these leaders sends a bad message, not only to the United States, but also to the folks who are fighting for human rights and civil liberties, as well as democracy across Africa.
Well, there were leaders from 5 nations who were not invited. That includes Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, Eritrea, and Guinea, all excluded because the African Union has suspended them over unconstitutional changes of government. So it seems Washington made some discriminating choices about whom to invite, don't you think?
The nations which were not invited were suspended by the AU because of the recent military coups. But outside of those, you could list a number of others who are also involved in conflicts and crimes against humanity. If you look at what's going on in Sierra Leone, if you look at what's going on in Egypt with President Sisi, if you look at the new president of Kenya, Ruto, there's charges at the ICC. If you look at what's going on in Zimbabwe, we are having violent crackdowns. If you look at what's going on in Chad, if you look at my own country, Uganda, we have a president who has been in power since 1986, in power for 36 years, and he's also invited. Ugandans are being killed on the streets during political campaign and elections. So if you look at the invitation list at this summit, it's not a list which shows you that the United States is showing commitment towards human rights. I believe they are prioritizing their business interests, and I believe they are trying to confront the growing influence of China and Russia in Africa. You're putting more money in the pockets of these dictators. You're putting more money in the pockets of Museveni so that in addition to the 37 years, he rules for 50 years. That's what he's here to do. He's here to get more investments. He's here to get more trade.
Daniel, let's talk about China, the continent's biggest trading partner, something that the U.S. has been watching closely but kind of struggling to counter in a meaningful way. Can this summit do anything to challenge Beijing's economic muscle in Africa?
China gives African leaders a blank check. Anything they want, whether you're killing civilians, whether you have free and fair elections in the country. That's why most of the African leaders have been running to China lately, because China is willing to fund a lot of projects in Africa. We have seen Uganda also get a lot of loans from China without any conditions. And I think that's why it's going to be very challenging for United States to match what China is doing, unless they're also going to put human rights, democracy, and individual liberties on the sidelines.
So there is China, there's also Russia, there are smaller powers like Turkey and the United Arab Emirates really stepping up their engagement with the African continent. But as you say, fostering democracy and human rights, not really priorities for those countries. What is the U.S. doing to advance a democratic agenda across the continent?
Recently, the U.S. launched a new policy towards sub-Saharan Africa, and that policy included fostering open society. They were talking about issues like accountability, rule of law, justice and dignity. They are talking about engaging more of civil society and making sure they fund non-profit organizations. So the United States has really done well in terms of providing funds to address some of those initiatives. Particularly, I can speak of my country, Uganda. They donated vaccines. They did donate COVID relief funds, but most of that money ended up in the wrong hands. Especially in the recent election, most of the COVID funds ended up funding the presidential election. So now the United States is talking about targeting funds instead of giving them to the government directly, but giving money to nonprofits, giving them as well to civil society.
Sometimes, as I'm sure you know, Daniel, these summits turn into kind of neo-colonial lectures where Western diplomats pontificate on the values of democracy, but not much is accomplished to advance democracy. Will that be the case here with the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit?
For me, bilateral discussions can have more of an impact. Instead of sitting in a room of 49 African head of states, President Biden will probably give a nice speech, but you don't get to engage directly and say, Mr. Museveni, you're abducting Ugandan civilians. 17 were abducted last week. You have a problem in your country. Engaging the leaders directly one-on-one, I think, would have a better impact than having 49 of them in one room and making a speech. You are unlikely to have any effect on terms of their democracy, human rights in their countries. But as far as lecturing, yes, I believe personally that African problems will eventually be resolved by Africans themselves, but we are a connected world right now. We live in a global society. Our economies are connected. COVID has taught us that if COVID is in Europe, someone can get on a plane and transport it to another country. So it's no longer, we can no longer look at the world as a neo-colonial, colonial relationship. We are already an interconnected world. So it's a matter of finding the balance with those relationships. And from our perspective, as human rights advocates in Africa, if the West can stand out of the way in certain areas, instead of funding these dictators and allowing them to sustain their regimes for decade after decade, if they can find the right balance and support civil society and support women education, women empowerment, women emancipation, enlightening people about democracy, rule of law, if they can spend that money building the core of African society, I believe the people will liberate themselves. That, I think, will be a better strategy towards Africa than what they are doing right now.
Daniel Kauma is a leader in the Ugandan opposition party known as the National Unity Platform, discussing with us this week's U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. He joined us from Washington, where he works with Ugandans and the diaspora. Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me today.
All right, that was the Daniel Kauma. Daniel Kauma is the NUP coordinator or leader for the United States of America. You remember very well the president, that's Bobby Wine, recently unveiled the new leadership in the diaspora, different countries having their own leaders, Europe, America, US, UK, and the rest. Anyway, coming back to what's currently happening, this is currently happening in the United States of America. I remember the US African Summit is going on, and it's going to take 3 days. But Ugandan is amidst the threats from the Ugandan parliament. Uganda government. Remember today, Uganda government came out and warned Ugandans residing in the diaspora, specifically those in Washington DC, those in the United States, who actually are currently doing exactly what the Uganda government, did not want them to do. It warned them against protesting Museveni's presidency at the United States African Summit, which is currently going on. Remember, Museveni was invited, and Museveni is currently in the US. But hey, mwena mukimanyi bulungi kiki Museveni kyakoze ensi yaffe no Uganda. So baganda baffe ekigenda maaso kyekino basazeewo baraisinga amaloboozi bo bali wali ku ground n'abavudde mu nsi ez'enjawulo okwetooloola US bazze mu bungi, abaana bazze mu bungi, era banange tubebaza bona abasobodde okubeera nga bagenda e Washington DC. Wetwogera kati kusaawa eno bagenda ku conference center, era nga live stream eno egenda kubeerako paka demonstrations zino ezinagwa. Tuli ku pages zaffe zonna bwemuzimanyi. I'm very sure you are watching this live stream from different platforms. Keep sharing this message. The most important of all is to let the world know what is currently going on in this our country Uganda. Quote us right. Abantu abasinga bagamba nti yes, abazungu tebagenda tuyamba. Yes, abazungu tebagenda tuyamba. Naye balekera awato okuyamba dictator Museveni. Era message y'abaganda baffe ono gye bakaringa, mulekeraawo collaborating ne ba dictators mu Africa. Balekeraawo okufundinga ba dictators, because currently tewandisuubidde United States kuyita Museveni naye olw'ensonga nti there is too much influence of Russia and China on the African continent. Balabanga boba balisema. So they rather put their interests above human rights violations, above democracy, above rule of law, to the point in Tibasola collaborating on Musajja nga Museveni. Capturing power in the 1986, and up to date the guy is still clinging on power. So baganda for the United States bali raising up their voices, and guess what? The message is loud and clear. The message is loud and clear. Bonna abebuzabuza abagamba nti tewali kigenda maaso basharing the video eno. Wherever you're watching this live stream from, please just press on that share button. You can as well osobola okusalamu video eno obutundutundu olw'ensonga egenda kuba mpanvu, sigenda gijjako kati.